Thanks, Liz. It says accurately in my biographical note that I'm primarily a writer interested in the implications of scientific ideas for society, and so I am approaching what I have to talk about perhaps from a rather different perspective to that of, well, everybody else in the room. However, I should say by way of preface that what I'm working on now, just developing some ideas, is about using more than one language, about bilingualism, multilingualism, both in a single individual and in a community or a nation. And I do have, as well as a scientific and political interest in this, I also have a profoundly personal one, which stems from the occasion when many years ago an Italian translator told me that I wrote as if English is not my first language, which is in fact the case, and I'm still wrestling with the terrible fact that I cannot speak my first language in a grammatical form. Anyway, I shall continue in English to make things easier for everyone. And I want to talk about territoriality in the context of language, and language in the context of territoriality. I should also say that, in the words of TV announcers, there's strong language from the outset. If anybody objects to hearing the F word, say so now, and I'll censor the clip. Okay. So this is a tram conflict. I think we're going to need some sound through the speakers. Sorry, can we get some sound through the... All right.
I know what you're doing. No one else is going to say it, because it's a society political thing.
Bigot. Bigot, you want to argue with someone?
Yeah, what? Yeah.
You have to listen to me.
Yeah. I don't know what you're talking about. But you're doing it behind the back.
Mom,
Yeah.
this is what I'm going to tell you.
You're right.
Not everyone in that world is speaking English.
That's right. I know they don't all speak English.
Yes.
I know that.
Just ask him.
But you know.
Don't worry, I mean, we're nearly through, so I think we've probably got the idea. Yeah, I'll just take it. Okay, well, it is rather self-censored. Okay, so that took place on a district line train on the London Underground sometime quite recently, and what happened was this woman became extremely incensed because she heard a couple of guys speaking an Eastern European language, and she did something. Her reaction was very revealing in two ways. First of all, her immediate assumption was that they were talking about her. So this showed somebody speaking what they believed to be their native language. The assumption is that anybody speaking a foreign language is up to something. It's about an assumption of distrust. And it's also, interestingly, a territorial statement, because it's difficult to pick it out, but some people have managed to transcribe the rant, which, as you can tell, was caught on a mobile phone. And she goes, "Don't fucking sit on my train and speak to me behind my back in your lingo. You know English when you want a job. You know English when you want a flat. You know English when you want fucking anything. But when you want to try and talk about us on the train, you talk in your own lingo." So there she is. She's making the accusation about conspiracy and distrust. And actually, there is something important there in what she's saying about the way that languages are used to conceal intentions from members of other communities. The problem here, of course, is she leaps to the conclusion that that's what's going on in this instance. She also, what's also very revealing is when she goes, "My train." And so it's not just that it's not a question of distrust, but a question of ownership and territory. She's insisting that the train, and by extension everything else that is British, belongs to her. At another point in the rant, she actually calls it a public train. So she defines it as public territory and asserts her rights over it. Sorry, can I just... Rosie, would you mind just getting it onto the presentation thing? Just put it on the blank thing for me, and I can take it from there. Sorry, thanks. So anyway, the man who's ultimately in charge of that public train, the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, also recently expressed his views about how people from abroad should speak the lingo. He used the same expression in London. Although his tone, as you'd expect from Boris Johnson, if you're familiar with our mayor, London mayor, and his language more appropriate to the setting, which was his column in the Conservative national newspaper, the Daily Telegraph. He fretted about how the internet and satellite TV allow immigrants to live in what he called a foreign language bubble. And if you think about the implications of that, it is not just that migrants, people living in London with origins overseas, should speak English as a public language here. That was actually much of what he was concerned about was about the relationship between being able to speak English and the right to receive benefits. But if you're actually objecting to somebody remaining and engaging with the culture and the language of the country where you've come from in the privacy of your own home, if that's a problem for you, the implication really is that actually there is no private space available to you as far as language is concerned. That actually what people living in London and in Britain should do is enter into the English language everywhere they are. And that's actually quite a troubling and difficult position for Boris Johnson to take, because in many respects his instincts are quite libertarian, and he's also deeply conservative in a very, very English sense. And he'd doubtless be the first person to agree with the old saying that an Englishman's home is his castle. But so here he is admitting to his discomfort, to his admitted discomfort, that actually that only applies to Englishmen. So linguistically and culturally, people's homes shouldn't be private territory, and so the only enclaves of foreign territory in London should be other countries' embassies. Okay, he didn't quite go as far as spelling all that out, but he came very close, and I think we're on the borders, to use a territorial metaphor, in our anguished discussions about identity and belonging and territory and our relationship in Britain with elsewhere, where we need to uncover that implication. So the reason that Boris has moved from what a lot of his libertarian and traditional conservative instincts are telling him to the position he's heading towards becomes clear as he goes on. He says, "In the face of the vast migratory influx we have seen, we must insist on English if we are to have any hope of eupeptic absorption and assimilation." And this is so typical of Boris Johnson, who makes a huge play of his classical education. So even in speaking about the English language, he uses words of Greek and Latin origin. And actually, that's not ironic. That's very, that's very much in keeping with his position. It's about not integration, but assimilation. So what you do is that you take little bits and pieces, little details from foreign cultures. You'll take Greek prefixes like you and Latin words like assimilate, and you'll integrate them into a structure that is entirely British, whatever that means. So, I mean, it's German, obviously, but you know, in the same way that in popular culture discussions about foreign cultural influences often dissolve or dilute into a line that says, yes, it's great what are the contributions that we've had from other cultures, and everybody then points to the dish chicken tikka masala. So we can have tikka masala, we can have the word bungalow, but we're not supposed to have actual discrete territorial or other communities in which the languages that those come from, the Indian subcontinental languages, retain their integrity. Of course, the problem for Johnson and people like him is that, you know, as we all know, this vision is unattainable. And part of the reason for this is territorial in the conventional sense, the physical sense. Migrants, when they come to a country, they don't disperse uniformly like gases. They gather together in neighbourhoods where they can spend time with each other and develop resources to sustain their culture, like shops, clubs, places to worship, and in the realm of language, weekend schools for their children, which typically combine lessons in grammar with immersion in usually very traditionalized forms of folk culture, dancing and singing and so on. And this process is highly self-reinforcing. I mean, quite an interesting and striking example is the Polish community, which numbered about 200,000 up to 2004 when Poland joined the European Union. That community was pretty much invisible unless you happened to be of Polish descent. And although there are striking tensions between the established Polish community, which was dominated by people who saw themselves as a cut above the rest, and are frankly appalled by the influx of young Polish men drinking lager and swearing on the underground. Again, we have these tram conflicts. This is a phrase that I heard recently in Latvia, and I'm going to come to this. Listening to Mary talk about safe distances in public space, the territory of public transport, trams and trains and buses seems to be a critical indicator and a critical site of where these conflicts are played out. But anyway, despite the older generation of Polish migrants having not terribly much in common with newcomers, those zones like East, much of West London from Ealing outwards, served as matrices which attracted further waves of migration and have consolidated them. So this does seem to be a pretty well unavoidable process. And it's a classic pattern. But in terms of language, there is a new factor at work, I believe. The classic story is that the first generation speaks the language of the old country, and they teach it to the second generation. In other words, parents speak to their kids in the language of the country that they came from. And so the second generation obviously has a certain amount of knowledge of the language because they still carry on talking to their parents. But that kind of declines as their parents get older and die, and their own command of the language degrades. And they teach a lot less of it to their kids. So you get this maintenance of language over the first two generations, then it goes right down like that. It doesn't disappear. It's still very significant, but there's this precipitous drop and then a downward decline. It's very easy to see how this has happened in the past. I mean, take the classic cliched case of, say, Italian migration to America. A migrant sails to America 100 years ago. She writes a letter home to say she's arrived safely. It takes a week or more to arrive. A few days pass while people find time to write a reply, and so on. You know, by the time it takes probably about a month to exchange some very limited written communication. So immediately the language community is cut off from its wellspring. The migrants obviously keep talking to each other in Italian or whatever the language is, but then the inevitable process carries on, and then we see in the kind of Sopranos effect where you see these people of Italian descent, fictional characters in New Jersey, who are completely immersed in their identity, not as Italians, but as Italian Americans. But they can't speak any Italian except for the Italian words that they use the whole time, which are the names of dishes and kinds of food. So identity can be maintained in a new territory, and token elements of language, words, and symbolically important notions can be sustained, but the language itself goes. What happens today? You get off the plane, you get on your phone straight away to phone your mother and say you're safely there. And that process continues. You're on Skype the whole time. You're logging onto websites in the language of the country that you've come from. You're sustaining and building your language community by relaying messages from where you've gone to about what it's like. You're comparing notes on a real-time basis, and it's cheap enough compared to the other costs of migration to be essentially frictionless. Within Europe, for legal migrants, and of course the story is utterly different for unauthorized migrants, but I'm talking here about legal migrants. Migration, the character of migration has changed radically in the same way. You know, even if you're short of money, you can get on a bus and get to the other side of Europe within 24 hours. If you've got a little bit more, you can get on a plane and be back home within half a day, and that's right across Europe. So you've got a combination of instantaneous telepresence and opportunities for free movement. Obviously, they look as though they may be restricted in this country, but within the continent of Europe, they will continue to be there, under which allow people to travel, circulate between countries in a way that is historically unprecedented. So, in many respects, migration becomes a radically different phenomenon to what it has been in the past. It's not a one-off, one-way relocation. It's a dynamic, two-way, ongoing process that changes the relationship between territories. So for the person travelling, they haven't exchanged one place for another. They haven't exchanged one territory for another. Where they've gone to becomes their place, and where they come from remains their place too. Michal Garapich, a social anthropologist at the University of Roehampton's Centre for Research on Migration and Multiculturalism, calls it, I've got to go back here, calls it Stalk Migration, which is an allusion to the signature bird of Eastern Europe, and a suggestion that it's more like the cyclical, seasonal migration of birds than the classic human story of no return. I hope you're pleased that I've got birds in here. But this interterritorial character is invisible to those in the destination countries because they're just not aware of it. And they're obsessing about the numbers of migrants that they perceive coming in. And even if they were aware of it, they wouldn't care about it. Can I just, how do I get back to the previous blank slide? Sorry, it's the slide. It's sort of, that was like a spoiler. Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you. Sorry. So what will happen in subsequent generations? Well, it is too early to say. And recent statistics from the United States do tend to show the classic pattern of heritage language loss that I just described among Spanish-speaking or later non-speaking Latino people. So there's this big drop from the second to the third generation in Spanish language use. But if this new fluency of super-territorial communication is going to have the effects that I suspect it may, actually you wouldn't really expect to see it happening right away. It's going to work through the most recent migrants. It's going to work through people who arrive with the full panoply of electronic communications available to them. So its effects will not yet be apparent. If this happens, it'll happen by enhancing, enriching the native tongue linguistic and cultural environment in which migrants live, sustaining their exposure to the language and multiplying their contacts with different kinds of speakers, which will give them opportunities, social, economic, family, intimate, that will serve as strong incentives to remain in the language community and thereby help to sustain it. So the difference is, instead of it being, oh God, I've got to go to Sunday school and learn about the folk songs, it's that young people will actually be feeling that being part of this electronic language community is them, and it's something that they can see feel that it's benefiting them in their everyday lives, the pleasure they get from social contact, from watching music videos in that language and so on and so forth. So instead of occupying a small physical ethnic neighbourhood, they'll be part of the much larger information networks of their homeland. So will children grow up in this extraterritorial information space? Under some conditions, they will, and I say that without not would or might, but because I have an example which demonstrates that in circumstances, special ones admittedly, they are doing so. So I'd like to make a few observations about this case, which is based on a recent visit I made, a couple of weeks ago to Latvia to look at the interesting and, to many people, troubling position of the large Russian minority, or Russian-speaking minority, which is actually larger than the Russian minority of Latvia. Estonia is in a similar position. About a quarter of the people in Latvia, it's not a large country, total population constantly declining, inexorably. It's down to 2 million, lost 500,000 people since independence, many of whom are here. The Latvian state is, frankly, horrified. It's this existential crisis, slow crisis is around the large size of the ethnic Russian and larger Russian-speaking minority, and it's particularly focused on the need to sustain the small Latvian language, which is spoken nowhere else, and to establish the Latvian language as the foundation of the Latvian nation and state. The context, of course, is one in which internationally Russia's assertive, shall we say, foreign policy is causing anxiety. After the experiences of Ukraine, there are suggestions that the Baltic republics may be next, and that those large minorities in Latvia and Estonia could be manipulated or exploited by Russia in order to further its aims of reasserting power over what it regards as its near abroad. There are the three key terms here: near abroad, post-Soviet space, and I'll come to the third in a bit. This is territorial and ritualized in certain respects. Almost every day there are reports of Russian planes and ships approaching Baltic airspace or territorial waters, and in quite a ritualized fashion they are intercepted by NATO aircraft, because those republics don't have their own air forces, as part of what's called the Baltic Air Policing Mission, in which NATO has actually reverted to its stated original mission of territorial defence, unlike its rather far-removed excursions in recent years. So, the fundamental problem that Latvian nationalists of varying shades of intensity have with the Russian-speaking minority is that nearly all of it is the product of processes that happened after the Baltic republics were incorporated coercively into the Soviet Union in 1940. So if you were a Latvian citizen before 1940, then you're a Latvian citizen under the new, in the view of the newly re-independent Latvian Republic. Or if you're descended from somebody who is a citizen, then you're also one. But if you arrived after 1940 and you're not Latvian, or you're descended from somebody who arrived after 1940 is not Latvian, you're not a citizen automatically, and you have to become one. 250,000 people still aren't citizens, which is an interesting position for them to be in. But incidentally, territorially speaking, it's not a bad one, because although they lack rights as citizens, they're free to go on their non-citizen passports anywhere in the EU, and they also can get into Russia without having visas. So economically, it's actually quite it has certain bonuses. Anyway, that's one of the many complexities of the situation, in which many ethnic Latvians still regard Russian speakers as occupiers. And their resentment reaches a peak each year on May the 9th, when Russian speakers commemorate the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany in what to them is not the Second World War, not the Allied victory over Nazi Germany, but the Soviet victory in their great patriotic war. And the symbolic charge was especially high this year because it's the 70th anniversary of 1945. And this is from the main event, which is held at the Victory Monument in Riga. There's quite an interesting territorial effect here, because the Victory Park in which this is established was originally conceived by the pre-war Latvian strongman Ulmanis, and then co-opted by the Soviet Union. And there's this huge obelisk that you can see down the avenue as you approach it from over the river, the main part of the city. So what the Latvians have done is built their huge national library, this great assertion of the stature of Latvian culture. and which kind of catches your eye instead of the obelisk. And if you're watching the news on Friday, you will probably have seen this remarkable hill-shaped building, which is serving as the venue for the EU heads of government meeting that our Prime Minister and Angela Merkel and so on attended. So by the evening, tens of thousands of people attended this event. The organisers claimed 220,000. And in the evening, it turns into kind of like a music festival, but with overtones. So people drape themselves in the Russian flag, and this is a favourite thing. It's kind of like a car in drag. This travesty thing is what they've done here. This is the key thing: T-34, the legendary T-34 Russian tank. And what the Red Army tank crews used to cover their tanks in slogans like "Hitler kaputt" and "To Berlin." And the irony that most of these are actually German-built vehicles isn't actually lost on this on whoever did this car, because this actually says trophy. So they've kind of claimed it. But earlier in the day, the rituals are bound together by a deep sense of affinity across the generations. The young people sing. Here they are, dressed up in patriotic war uniforms and doing these sort of jaunty numbers, and very popular with middle-aged people dancing in front of them. And a lot of the helpers at the festival are young people, and here I hope we can see them. Let's have a quick musical interlude. I wonder if you can guess who the musician is. Oops.
It could be loud.
Yeah, I got it. But note these people. Let's see what they're doing here. So that this was going on through the entire day, and this is like from 10 o'clock in the morning till when I left at about 9 o'clock at night. Constant stream of people bringing carnations and other flowers, handing them to these kids, who are really cheerful, jolly, doing the whole process. This is a genuine popular ritual. The band, by the way, is led by the film director Emir Kusturica, and in the spirit of this well-known maverick, he did actually do a song. I couldn't quite believe it. He did a song. Not only did a song in German, but a song called "Drang nach Osten," which is a German phrase referring to the expansion of the German race into Slavic lands. And it's the only Emir Kusturica could get away with that, and people loved it. But for me, the most moving thing, and I found this very deeply moving, was this ritual, which I saw enacted a number of times throughout the day. This guy, you can maybe just about see some medals. He is one of the few remaining veterans. And presumably this father is encouraging, presumably his daughter, to hand a flower. And I saw this happening time and time again, this ritual of affirming gratitude. I mean, talk about a gift. This was the most profound of gifts, both affirming the debt of gratitude that they feel that they owe the veterans, and also the deep kinship, the deep affinity between the generations. I mean, that guy was born decades after the war, and yet it was important to him to teach, to encourage his child to take part in this ritual. Those children will surely grow up. They're growing up in a Russian space of symbols, culture, and bonds between people while living in Latvia and speaking Latvian every day. Latvia can live with that. Despite the flag waving, there seems little desire among Russian speakers for a territorial reabsorption by Russia. They generally appreciate the benefits that I alluded to of being in an EU country. And actually, it seems they do tend to regard themselves as somewhat different from the Russians in Russia. But they do want to live in what, and here's the third key term, they do want to live in the Russian information space. Latvia can't match the budgets that Russian telly has for game shows, movies, or music videos. And in this information space, they're saturated in messages, explicit and symbolic, imparting the Russian government's view of the world and pursuing the Russian government's foreign policy interests. Compatriot policy, it's called. Political analysts recognize that Russia can use its soft power in the information space to subvert neighbouring states without violating their territorial integrity. And an illustration of this continuing life can be seen in this picture. Now, this represents two symbolic practices that are significant. Now, first is this, the St. George ribbon. If any of you saw the immense parade of tanks and nuclear missile launchers in Red Square on May the 9th on TV, you will have seen this imagery, this origin plaque imagery, which dates back to the 18th century. It's from Russian imperial days, but was reinvented, revived as a commemorative symbol, something a little bit like wearing poppies in this country, but significantly different, as recently as 2005 in Russia, and promoted very heavily by the Russian government and media. The other is this placard. Now, what's the idea of this? This is called an Immortals Regiment March. And the idea is that people get photos of relatives who are no longer living, and they carry them as memorials. They're like, they keep their veteran ancestors marching, although those individuals themselves are dead. Now, this tradition dates back only 3 years, hugely popular. And it was actually invented by an independent TV station in Siberia and taken up very widely as a personal commemoration, but then criticised because it seemed to be being exploited by the Russian government. And one group of activists who are independent journalists who have now territorially relocated themselves to Riga pointed out that the Russian Culture Ministry shared on its Facebook page a picture of Putin's favourite biker, one of the night wolves, and behind him was somebody carrying one of these Immortals placards, and it was a picture of the notorious Soviet security secret police boss Lavrentiy Beria. Presumably this is not a direct descendant of Lavrentiy Beria who's carrying the placard. But the point here is that these Russian speakers, I say this by the way because it includes small Belarusian, Polish and Ukrainian minorities who actually speak Russian for preference. These people are not simply continuing a ritual that they've been practicing from Soviet times. They are in communication with the larger Russian information space and bringing symbolism across into Latvian physical territory, which they are at pains to enact in an entirely personal, apolitical way, if one may use that term in a restricted sense, but which inevitably feeds into the imagery of Russian geopolitical symbolism. The St. George ribbon being a particularly contentious one because it's worn by every heavily armed pro-Russian separatist militiaman in the rebel provinces of eastern Ukraine. But to end on a more positive note, I feel that deterritorialized information spaces actually offer huge opportunities to smaller countries like Latvia and to a whole range of countries and cultures working out new relationships among themselves across physical migration. Latvia, as I mentioned, has this existential background crisis of inexorable population decline, and much of it is due to emigration. The country may not be able to reverse it. It's very hard to see what economic poles of attraction could be set up for a country whose sole natural resource, as I'm assured, is timber. But at least now its people can remain in its language community within the internet, which I suspect may turn out to have an as yet unappreciated power to sustain languages that lack political strength and economic competitiveness. The electronic deterritorialization of language can actually, I believe, be a really powerful force for diversity. Although it's a function of globalization, it actually counters it by providing the conditions in the linguistic and cultural environment in which diversity can be sustained and developed. And actually, among other things, I think it might turn out to save the world from being taken over by the English language.